It's the hidden, messy truth about my family's foundation, and honestly, the hardest secret we've ever had to face. We always thought we lived a perfect life, anchored by the most honorable man we knew, my grandfather, Thomas. When he died, the grief was overwhelming, yes, but manageable. What came next? What we discovered in his secret files? It didn't just hurt us. It fundamentally broke the memory of who he was. This is the story of how our perfect world collapsed, and how we learned that sometimes love isn't enough to excuse a decades-long lie. This is The Anchor and the Secret. My grandfather, Thomas Anderson, was the quiet, immovable anchor of our lives. He was tradition, comfort, and an unwavering moral compass, all wrapped up in a life that seemed perfectly, impossibly honest. The funeral was proof. The sound of quiet weeping, the stream of heartfelt tributes. The air was thick with genuine, collective grief. We weren't just mourning a man, we were mourning the loss of the most fundamentally good person we had ever known. My grandmother, Martha, sat beside me, her posture radiating an agonizing but dignified sorrow. Our grief was sharp and deep, but in a strange way, it was clean. We lost our perfect world, but we still believed it had been perfect. 3 weeks later, the silence in the house was a suffocating pressure. Martha was trapped in Thomas's armchair, her personal fortress of worn leather and memory. I stayed with her, listening to the quiet tick of the grandfather clock, a rhythm that now felt horribly wrong. Then, the certified letter arrived. It was thick, legal, and formal, breaking the mournful stillness. Martha told me to open it, assuming it was a routine estate formality. It wasn't. Inside was a deed for a house hours north of us, listing the owners as Thomas Anderson and Liam Vance. The name was instantly foreign, instantly jarring. The packet detailed 35 years of flawless monthly mortgage payments, all from an account we had never known Thomas possessed. The payments had stopped the day he died. The last sentence of the accompanying lawyer's note, Mr. Vance has inquired about the sudden cessation of maintenance funds, hit me with the force of a physical blow. The cold certainty settled in my stomach. This was not a clerical error. This was a parallel life. The wave of betrayal that followed was more painful than the grief. It was corrosive. Every memory of Thomas, every quiet moment, every declared vow, every word of wisdom was immediately tainted. The foundation of our entire family history, the history of a man we believed was flawless, was collapsing into dust. My parents were a hurricane of confusion and anger. My father, Robert, Thomas's legitimate son, kept asking over and over, "Who is Liam Vance?" He needed the name to make sense, but it remained a meaningless ghost. But Martha was already moving past the question. Her deep, traditional sense of loyalty had been shattered, and only a desire for justice, or maybe retribution, remained. "We are driving there," she commanded, her voice low and dangerously steady. "We will look this man in the face, and we will have the truth." The drive was agonizingly silent, thick with the dread of what we might find. When we arrived, the address led us to a quiet suburban street. A man in his mid-30s was working on a gate, his movements precise and focused. He looked strong, weathered, and utterly ordinary. But when he turned, the shock was immediate and involuntary. He carried the indelible marks of the Anderson men, the shape of his jaw, the slightly stoic set of his mouth, and those eyes, piercing, sharp blue, exactly like Thomas's. There was no need for an introduction. He was Thomas's son. I spoke first, trying to be the barrier. Are you Liam Vance? We're from Thomas Anderson's family. I gestured toward the car, where Martha sat, radiating a terrifying calm. When I spoke her name, Martha Anderson, the color drained from Liam's face. The small metallic clang of the tool dropping from his hand was the only sound in the afternoon air. He stood frozen, comprehension dawning in his eyes, a look that told me that he had been dreading this specific moment for 30 years. Martha didn't wait. She approached him, demanding an answer. Who are you to my husband? What right do you have to his property? Liam's voice, when it came, was a rough, defensive whisper. I'm his son, ma'am. He was my father. My father let out a strangled sound from behind me, a noise of pure disbelief. I heard my mother choke back a sob, but Martha was focused only on Liam. A lie, Martha hissed. A lie maintained with every breath he took outside of this house. Every birthday, every holiday, every shared family moment, he was living another life. It was never a secret to me, Liam countered, his voice gaining a hard edge of bitterness. He visited me here once a month, every single month for 30 years. He paid for this house so my mother could raise me safely. He was my father too, Mrs. Anderson, just not the one you showed off to the world. The revelation was excruciating. Thomas hadn't just slipped once. He had consciously maintained two separate spheres of existence. Every business trip or night we excused was potentially a secret visit to this house, to this son. He used devotion to build our lives, Martha whispered. The quiet fury returned. You are the living proof of his deceit. I will not permit the fruit of his lie to remain. We are selling this house. You have 30 days to vacate. The mandate was cold, final, and absolute. Martha, fueled by the deepest sense of hurt, had declared war. The drive back felt like riding a compressed spring. My father was consumed by the pain of his own legitimacy, wondering if he was merely the respectable accessory to Thomas's public identity. I couldn't join their fury. I felt a growing, desperate need to understand the man, not the villain. Liam was a victim too, forced into this painful confrontation. Martha's pain was justified, but her path felt cruel, a final act of destruction. I retreated to the attic and found Thomas's old trunk. Deep inside, tied with brittle, faded twine, was a box labeled Correspondence. It held the long, buried conversation between a father and a hidden son. I spent hours reading them, letting the sound of their words fill the vast, silent house. There were childish drawings, then school reports, and eventually the deeper, more complex notes of adolescence. He wasn't just paying a debt. He was actively, desperately parenting by proxy. He advised Liam on heartbreak, comforted him after his first disappointment, and celebrated triumphs. In a letter from 1995, Thomas finally addressed the monumental lie. Liam, I read your letter 3 times. Yes, what I did was wrong. It began with a moment of weakness and ended in decades of fear. Fear of losing Martha, fear of disappointing the life I built here. I'm a coward, son. I live with that knowledge every day. But please believe me when I tell you the love I have for you is not a shadow. It is a separate, true branch of my heart. I cannot uproot myself to fully include you, but I will never let your branch wither. It wasn't an apology for his actions, but a heartbreaking confession of his spiritual torment. He hadn't chosen between us. He had tragically divided himself, sacrificing his own peace and integrity in the process. I tried to show the letters to my father, but he wouldn't touch them. He should have been honest. he insisted. That confession doesn't excuse the hypocrisy. We were living a public lie. The deadline for eviction was looming. I knew Martha would not relent. Her resolution was absolute. If she evicted Liam, we would succeed in legally destroying Thomas's second life, but we would destroy the last remnants of peace in our own family in the process. I drove back north, alone. I found Liam stacking the final boxes, his face etched with weariness and defeat. He made no plea, only stating he understood Martha's position. She's serious, Liam, I confirmed, my voice weighted with regret. She's ready to sign the papers. I sat down and started reading Thomas's 1995 confession aloud. I read the line about the secret
poisoning him. I read how he had failed to merge his two loves. Liam covered his eyes with his hand, shaking his head. He taught me how to carve my initials in the trunk of that old oak, he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. I was maybe 8. He carved his first, T.A., then he helped me do mine, L.V. He told me the tree was strong enough to hold 2 different names, 2 different families at the same time. The oak was the key. It wasn't just property, it was a symbol, an external artifact of Thomas's internal struggle to hold both truths. I pulled out the last letter, the one dated just 6 months before Thomas died. It was addressed to Liam, but it spoke directly to the future. Liam, I am running out of time. My doctors are less optimistic than I let on. I did what I did to keep you and your mother safe. But the secret has poisoned me. I know I cannot ask Martha for forgiveness, but I can hope for peace. I love Martha, and I love you. Please don't let my mistake hurt her when I'm gone. Tell her about the old oak tree in the front yard. It was always meant to be shared. I handed the letter to him. He wanted you to tell her about the oak. He wanted the secret to end with an attempt at reconciliation, not a scorched earth battle. The following morning, I placed that final letter on Martha's mahogany desk right next to the eviction papers. I insisted she read it before signing anything. Her hand trembled as she held the paper. She read slowly. The sound of the rain outside the room was the only noise. Running out of time, poisoned me. I love Martha, and I love you. The word poisoned finally broke through the wall of her rage. He hadn't just been a reckless villain. He had been a man in constant agony, consumed by his own decision. The anger didn't vanish, but it was replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow for the life he had secretly endured. He tortured himself, Chloe, she whispered, the tears returning after weeks of dry fury. He lived half his life afraid of the truth. We drove back one last time, just the 2 of us. Martha walked slowly, deliberately toward the giant, gnarled oak tree outside Liam's house. She didn't speak to Liam, who stood respectfully a few feet away, silent and resigned. She simply walked to the trunk and placed her hand flat against the bark, then slowly traced the deep, old carvings. T.A.L.V. When she finally turned, the crushing weight of the past month had eased, replaced by a terrible, complicated peace. I won't sell the house, Martha said, her voice stronger than I expected. It was his final wish, and Thomas Anderson, for all his mistakes, always kept his promises to me. She paused, gathering her final thoughts. He carved 2 names, Liam, not 1. The truth is that the oak tree, the family, was strong enough to hold us both. It was Thomas who wasn't strong enough to admit it. It was a cold, conditional peace, achieved through sacrifice and profound sorrow. We were not one happy, merged family. We were 2 branches, bound by one magnificent, deeply flawed man and a shared, honest truth. The facade of perfection was gone, but in its place, we had found something stronger. The end of the secret. And for the first time since the funeral, the silence was quiet air, ready for the sound of a very different future. The end of the war did not bring peace.
it brought a new kind of silence. Martha's conditional surrender, her decree that Liam could stay but must remain forever outside our visible lives, was a fragile, uncomfortable shield. It protected her from further hurt, but it kept the rest of us frozen. 6 months passed. The Anderson house felt cavernous. My father, Robert, was the most wounded. He avoided Martha, unable to look at the woman who had lived the lie alongside him. He avoided me because I had been the one to introduce the truth. He was no longer grieving Thomas's death, but mourning the loss of the infallible father he thought he knew. He was obsessed with one question. Was I just the respectable son, Chloe, the one he had to keep, while Liam was the one he truly chose? I became the designated bridge. I drove up to Sacramento every few weeks, ostensibly to check on the house, but really to check on Liam. He was quiet, focused on his work as a craftsman. He never asked for anything, never pushed for acceptance. He knew his place in the shadow. But every time I saw him, those Anderson eyes, Thomas's eyes, looking out from under that same familiar brow, it was a reminder that the secret was not gone. It was simply separated by a 4-hour drive. We lived in limbo, bound by a shared secret and a single deed we couldn't speak of. But Thomas's choices, even in death, were not done with us. The true breaking point came, quite appropriately, in the middle of a storm. It was a severe late spring tempest that raged for 2 days. And on the third morning, my phone rang. It was Liam. His voice was strained, not just by fear, but by the discomfort of having to call me at all. "Chloe," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you. The wind, it caught the old oak. It didn't fall, but a huge branch split off. It's hanging right over the roof. It needs professional removal immediately, or the house will be destroyed." The oak tree, the symbol Thomas had chosen to represent the family's dual nature, now split and threatening destruction, it perfectly mirrored our unstable emotional ground. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about the property Thomas left behind. I knew I couldn't handle it alone. It was a shared problem, and it required the man Thomas had legally named his son to address the man Thomas had officially raised. I drove home and found Robert staring blankly at the TV. I told him about the oak. "Call a tree service, Chloe," he muttered, dismissing me. "No," I insisted. "It's Thomas's property, shared. Liam is there. You need to call him. You need to figure this out together." He looked at me with open resentment. "I have no interest in dealing with him. He's the physical manifestation of my father's failure. I don't want to see him, hear him, or share a property line with him." "Then you're choosing to lose Thomas's money and that house," I said, my voice hardening. "You're punishing Liam for Thomas's mistake, and in doing so, you're becoming as rigid as the secret was. Thomas wanted the oak to be shared. This is your chance to decide what shared means." The next day, Robert drove north. I drove up a few days later, arriving unannounced. The scene was surreal. A massive crane was parked on the front lawn, and men in harnesses were working on the damaged oak. Standing near the porch, looking up, were Robert and Liam. They stood far apart, a visible line of tension between them, but they were talking. Robert, the polished architect who designed high-rises, was wearing a clean jacket. Liam, the skilled carpenter, was in heavy work boots and jeans. They looked at the tree, the problem, but they saw two different things. I stayed back, listening. "You need to trim the crown aggressively," Robert was saying, analytically. "Reduce the wind load. I can draft a calculation on the structural stress of the remaining fork." Liam shifted his weight. "You can't just trim the crown. That'll kill the tree in the long run. We need to brace the fork with steel rods and then trim the deadwood to encourage balance. You treat it like a building. I treat it like a living thing." It was their whole relationship summarized. Robert built on structure and calculation. Liam built on resilience and practical growth. Suddenly, Robert turned from the tree and looked directly at Liam.
All the professional distance dissolved. The anger that had been festering for months finally erupted. "Why you?" Robert asked, his voice shaking with raw pain. "Why maintain this for 30 years? Was this life more important to him than his real family? Did he love you more?" Liam didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He simply walked to a worn wooden bench near the porch. A bench, I realized, Thomas must have built. He sat down and patted the space next to him. "Sit down, Robert," he said, quietly. Robert hesitated, then sat. Liam didn't talk about the house or the money. He talked about fishing. I was maybe 15. We went out on the lake up near Tahoe. He never talked about his other life. Never. But that day, he talked about his father, your grandfather, who was a stern, unforgiving man. Thomas had wanted to be an architect, but his father forced him into finance. He hated it. He hated the lack of control. He looked at Robert, his blue eyes holding the same deep sadness I remembered seeing in Thomas's. He told me he kept me hidden because he thought he was protecting me from the kind of suffocating expectations and rules he grew up with. He said, "I gave Robert the life I was supposed to live, and I gave you the freedom to build your own." He wasn't choosing one of us over the other, Robert. He was trying to be two different men because he was afraid he couldn't be one whole one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn wooden carving, a tiny, beautifully detailed sparrow. "He carved this for me when I was a kid." He said he was the one who was trapped in the cage, but I could fly. He loved us both, Robert. He just loved us both wrong. For Robert, this was the truth he needed. Not a legal explanation, but a personal admission of Thomas's own failure and pain. He saw Thomas not as a villain, but as a man suffocated by responsibility, flawed, and deeply unhappy. Thomas's love for Liam was born of guilt and a desperate need for a different life. Thomas's love for Robert was born of duty and expectation. Neither were perfect, but both were real. Robert and Liam spent the rest of the day working on the tree, not as enemies, but as brothers in shadow, solving a physical problem that represented their shared dilemma. I drove back to tell Martha. She listened to the story of the oak, the professional conflict, and the personal confession. She listened to how Robert finally stopped asking, "Did he love me more?" and started asking, "Why was he so unhappy?" A week later, Martha told me she needed to make another drive north, but she didn't want me to go. She went alone. She didn't stay long. When she returned, she didn't speak of the trip immediately. She went straight to Thomas's study, unlocked his safe, and came out holding a small, heavy silver watch. It was Thomas's favorite, a vintage heirloom he rarely wore but always valued. The next morning, a package was delivered to Liam Vance in Sacramento. Inside there was no letter, no legal decree, just the silver watch and a small antique key. "The key is to the shed on the property," Martha told me later, quietly. "Thomas kept his tools in there. Real tools, not the ones he used here in the city. The ones he used when he was building things with his own hands." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were clear. "I told him he couldn't be an Anderson, Chloe, and I was wrong. He is not my son, and he won't be called Robert's brother. But Thomas's life created him, and Thomas's tools are his inheritance. It's time we stopped hiding the root." It was her final, perfect act of imperfect forgiveness. She didn't offer a hug or a grand speech. She offered a shared history. The watch was a piece of the life he lived with her, and the tools were a piece of the life he lived with Liam. Robert, seeing Martha's surrender, slowly began to thaw. He still needed time, but the fury was gone, replaced by a quiet shared sorrow with his mother. The life we had was broken, shattered by the weight of a 40-year deception, but we were no longer fractured by lies. The perfect, fragile house of the Andersons was replaced by something stronger, a flawed, resilient structure, capable of holding both light and shadow. The secret was over. Thomas's two families remained separate, but the shared roots of the oak tree, now professionally braced and pruned for long-term survival, ensured that neither branch would ever threaten the other again.